Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to everyone who's joining us for this last public panel session of the important co-sponsored workshop on culture, heritage, and climate change, co-hosted by ICSM UNESCO and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We've really had an exciting week of discussions around the important issues related to culture and heritage and climate change. And in many ways, this public panel provides an important full stop to that discussion. We kicked off Monday's public event with a discussion around knowledge systems, looking at how we understand the world and move through it. We then went on to a discussion on Wednesday around the impacts. How does our being in the world change that situation? And how do we use our understanding of culture and heritage to understand impacts? And today we take that knowledge about how we move through the world and the impacts we experience and look at how we interpret the kind of solutions and responses that might be available to us. So really delighted to have everyone along for this discussion. We're going to be following the same kind of format that we've used in our two other public events, so you should be very familiar with it. We'll have some opening comments by the three Science Steering Committee co-chairs of the meeting. And after that, I will then introduce our esteemed panelists, and we'll be posing them questions, looking for answers and reflections on important issues related to solutions and responses. So perhaps let me start off this process, because time is short, by introducing myself. I'm Deborah Roberts. I am a Scientific Steering Committee co-chair of this particular meeting, representing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. And really why this meeting has been important and why the discussions today are particularly important to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is that, as I've said many times before during the course of this week, we really are a large global service organization. Our job is to provide policymakers and decision makers around the world with an objective source of information drawn from the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic literature about three things: the causes of human-induced climate change, the impacts we experience as a result of it, and probably most importantly and relevant in the 21st century, our responses to that particular challenge. So obviously, having a discussion today about how culture and heritage can help us understand what responses and what solutions are available to humanity at this point where climate change really poses an existential threat to us, our culture, our heritage, the ecosystems we rely on, is of critical interest to the IPCC. And I believe these discussions will be key informants in the kind of discussions the IPCC will be taking forward in its remaining work during the sixth assessment cycle, and certainly be a key informant in the seventh assessment cycle. Without further ado, what I would like to do is call on my fellow co-chairs of the Scientific Steering Committee, both Will and Jyoti, to provide some background views from the viewpoint of their organizations. I'll start off with Jyoti Hosagara, who is here representing UNESCO, to provide some insights around why this discussion today is important to UNESCO. Jyoti, over to you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and it's a great pleasure to join you for this last panel discussion, and thank you very much for this introduction, and a big welcome to all of you from UNESCO. I want to just reflect a little bit on the issues around solutions that we are focused on today, because we talked a lot, and I hope you joined us on Wednesday, we talked a lot about the impacts that climate change is having on culture, and talking about impacts on culture, cultural heritage sites, makes it seem as if culture might be a passive victim of the negative consequences of climate change. And this is, of course, true, because we know that World Heritage Sites, for example, and intangible cultural heritage are being impacted by climate change. World Heritage Sites today are being most significantly impacted by climate change related issues of different types. However, it is Also very important to recognize that culture is a huge, untapped wellspring of potential efforts to both mitigate the impacts as well as provide and inform adaptation strategies for climate action. Natural heritage sites, for example, are ecosystems that act as carbon sinks. A 2014 IUCN study found that an estimated 5.7 billion tons of forest biomass carbon is stored within natural World Heritage sites in the pan-tropical regions of the world alone. Another instance, for example, is that in World Heritage cities, the vernacular wisdom of the traditional building practices and traditional planning practices are very important for encouraging the sustainable use of resources, so that traditional building patterns using local building materials and techniques, responses to the local geographical location, whether it's on a coast or on a mountaintop or in a desert climate. These are responses to manage the impacts of the particular location, and it's a climatic response to manage within a particular geographical location, and is very often a passive building solution, where it is an adaptation strategy to deal with the particular pressures of those regions. This is a long a knowledge that has been accumulated and refined and developed over generations that is now being very quickly lost with formulaic solutions for building with concrete blocks and glass and steel towers globally. So this is another very important source of information and lessons for adaptation strategies. Cities are also at the forefront of innovation and creativity in the transition to more responsible production and consumption patterns. For instance, in Australia, the creative city of Melbourne, which is a city of literature, is using literature and writing as a tool to help communities gain a better comprehension of the challenges of climate change. The participants of the World Heritage City Dialogues of the World Heritage Cities program, organized in October 2021 on the World Cities Day topic of adapting cities for climate resilience, also pointed out the importance of learning from traditional knowledge systems to mitigate and adapt to climate change and increase resiliency. Historical settlements throughout the world have developed systems to manage disaster risk and minimize flooding. For instance, in Bahrain, the higher areas of the island were left unbuilt and used as cemeteries. This helps to absorb water and avoid flooding. Efforts are also being made by the creative sector to reshape production processes and lessen its carbon footprint. Book printing has a significant impact on forests, while cinema and music festivals are often energy intensive, and artists increasingly use digital technologies, which result in high energy consumption as well as electronic waste. Living heritage is the form of local and indigenous knowledge and is particularly vital source of resilience. For example, the Kalasha people in Pakistan use an ancestral meteorological and astronomical knowledge system to help predict weather patterns, plan their harvests, and raise livestock. This traditional know-how can guide local planning to make communities more resilient. Museums, cultural institutions, and heritage site interpretation centers can be key actors for raising awareness and promoting dialogue around climate action. Artists also play a particularly important role in raising awareness, whether by photographers documenting the wonders of the world, films about climate change and its impacts, or youth theatre initiatives to engage young people. Culture, as a key tool for storytelling, can be a means of helping communities cope with anxiety or the loss of one culture in relation to climate change. Culture-based approaches can, without doubt, help shift the focus of climate negotiations from competing interests to shared values and common good. And UNESCO is increasingly vocal on the international stage in promoting culture for climate action. For example, in 2021, culture was included in the COP26 meeting, as well as during the G20 hosted by Italy, where heritage and climate change were in the spotlight. So what I'm pointing out here is that culture is very much about local action, local communities, specific heritage sites, but at the same time, the lessons from it and the need and the importance to connect culture with larger climate policy and climate action, as well as cultural policies and culture and action in the sphere of the culture sector, means that it is a question of relating global policies and actions with local actions and the interpretation of these policies. Culture is also the bridge between global ambitions and locally adapted solutions at the regional and national and community level. At a national level, strengthening synergies between culture and other policy areas will be essential for more comprehensive and effective policy action. Cultural policies themselves should be reviewed and adapted to accelerate their contribution to climate action. Currently, they are rarely systematically addressing the issue of climate change, despite the fact that its consequences are already affecting cultural and natural heritage, living heritage, and the creative sector. In this regard, UNESCO has recently updated the 2007 policy document on the impacts of climate change on World Heritage properties to make available the most current knowledge and technology on the subject to guide the decisions and actions of the World Heritage community. This updated policy document was endorsed by the World Heritage Committee in July of 2021 and will be examined by the General Assembly of States Parties to the World Heritage Convention in November 2023 for adoption. With that, I want to stop here and wish you all a very good panel discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jyoti. Very interesting. I've really enjoyed the inputs from UNESCO at these open panel sessions and encouraged by the work that UNESCO is doing really to use culture and heritage to keep our options open in terms of how we respond to climate change. So your inputs have been greatly valued, and I think our audience, like myself, would have found them incredibly helpful and useful. Over now to the third co-chair of the meeting, Dr. Will McGarry, who is here representing ICSM. Will, could I ask you to reflect on the ICSM view on solutions and how they're important to our discussion around culture and heritage?
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you, Jyoti, and hello to everybody. My name is Will McGarry, and I am the ICSM co-chair of this important meeting today. In today's meeting's discussions, participants will be discussing the roles of culture and heritage in transformative change and alternative sustainable futures. This includes themes like the capacity of historic buildings, landscapes, and traditional land use to hold carbon, cultural and natural heritage as sources of resilience or refuge in response to disasters, and heritage as an inspiration for art, connection, understanding, and action on climate change, like Jyoti was just discussing. As with the previous day's topics, the white paper prepared for this meeting has provided a wealth of knowledge, which will serve as starting points for these discussions based around key questions on climate justice, impacts and capacity buildings, and the power of heritage in climate thinking. It's been 3 years since ICSM released the report Futures of Our Pasts, Engaging Cultural Heritage in Climate Action. which scoped the myriad of ways cultural heritage contributes to achieving the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. The report outlines the culture-based solutions in 4 broad categories of climate response: mitigation and greenhouse gas emissions reductions, adaptation, planning for loss and damage, and building climate ambition and capacity. Many of these themes have already been introduced in previous panels, but I want to take a minute to stress the mitigation dimension of this because, as Deborah mentioned in her opening, when culture is raised as a climate solution, more likely than not, it is in an adaptation context. ICSM starts with the view that a precautionary approach that pursues pathways limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no or limited overshoot is the most effective approach for the protection, conservation, and management of cultural heritage. ICSM's president, Professor Teresa Patricio, referenced this point in her remarks at the launch event. This view is rooted in the fact that for many natural and cultural systems, adaptation in the face of climate risks is expected to be more challenging at 2 degrees of global warming rather than 1.5, if not impossible. And for this reason, ICSM stresses in its own work and that of its international scientific committees, attention to the cultural dimension of greenhouse gas reduction, looking at the role of culture in consumption and production patterns, building decarbonization ambition, mediating acceptance of change, landscape scale solutions, and the role of traditional and indigenous knowledge. And one of the great benefits of taking a cultural approach to these topics is that these solutions often represent win-win scenarios, improving well-being and societal outcomes while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Protecting our cultural and natural heritage places and decarbonizing our society through sustainable building practices has far wider benefits for society beyond just carbon mitigation. They can change the narrative of climate action from one of personal sacrifice and loss to one of mutual benefit and opportunity. At Wednesday's panel discussion, I proposed that culture is a lens for us to better understand key aspects of climate change. Central to this is making the narrative people-centered, which allows us to understand the cultural reality of past and lived experience. To quote Marcy Rockman, every place has a climate story, and these stories are powerful communicative tools to stress urgency and increase climate literacy. But we must also be honest when telling these stories. While discussions this week have focused on the positive role of heritage in climate action, there's also a need for us to be more critical about culture and its wider role in the climate crisis. Because the truth is that culture is one of the causes of anthropogenic climate change. We've been in the thick of the Industrial Revolution, the carbon era, for hundreds of years now. And this means that many of our traditions, cultures, and beliefs, at least in contemporary industrial societies, are deeply entangled with fossil fuels. One of the more complex intersections between heritage and climate action is where conflict exists between carbon adaptation or mitigation and heritage. Examples of this may be the rich industrial heritage, both past and living heritages of music or labor, which tie communities together and are intricately connected to the activity which directly contributes to climate change. So just to close, while thinking about the future, we must begin by understanding that culture and heritage has always been at the heart of the climate story. What we are doing this week is reiterating this reality, because while culture may have played a role in the current situation, it also has a key role in addressing it. Thank you very much, Deborah.
Thanks, Will. And again, can I say the same thing I said to Jyoti? I've really appreciated the input on behalf of ICSM, and I think this particular input is just so important to this discussion because you've provided a real reality check in terms of what we need to consider, really identifying culture not only as a possible solution, but potentially a driver of some of the problems that we are dealing with. And also a reality check that we need to think about the fact that we are in a suboptimal world, and things like losses and damages are critical considerations across not only the climate change spectrum, but how that might relate to culture and heritage. So I really value that reality check. And let me take this opportunity, because I'm not sure I will have a formal opportunity for the remainder of this meeting to thank you both. It's been a real pleasure to work with you on this important meeting, and hopefully this indicates our three organizations coming together in a much more integrated way as we move forward. But thanks to you both at a personal level. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce now our esteemed panel, and I'd like to thank them up front for making time in their busy calendars to be with us this afternoon to share their views and thoughts. I know that's often difficult, and so we are appreciative of your commitment to this particular meeting. We have five remarkable panelists with us, and I'll just take you through who is present with us. We've got Ms. Ariadne Goring, who's CEO of the Pollination Foundation, who's staying up very late in Melbourne to be with us. So welcome, Ariadne, and thank you for that. Professor Robin Cunningham, who is UNESCO Chair in Archaeological Ethics and Practice in Cultural Heritage at Durham University. I'm very fond of Durham, so welcome, Robin. We've got Dr. Samir Abdullah, Chair of the ICMOS Working Group on Syria and Iraq, and Samir and I have been in a number of sessions together, so I'm really looking forward to hearing more from him. Dr. Chandni Singh, Senior Research Consultant, School of Environment and Development at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Chandni I know well from the work on the IPCC, and so I'll be looking to her to continue to fly the IPCC flag in our discussions and particularly focus in on the urban issues. And then Professor Rohit Jigyasu, Program Unit, International Center for the Study of Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, or ICROM, who's joining us all the way from Rome, which we can see in the background there. Welcome, Rohit. The way we will work through this is I'll pose a question to a group of our panelists, asking them for reflections. If there are other panelists who want to come in on a particular question, please feel free to do so, or if you want to respond to a particular answer given by one of your fellow panelists, please feel free to do that. I think we're going to pick up on this idea, and many of you will know the famous quote, the further backward you look, the further forward you can see. And very often, I don't think we, from a human point of view, look enough into our past as a way of understanding the present climate change challenge that we face. So I'm going to start off by asking Robin, Samir, and Rohit, and I'll ask you in turn, to reflect on how you might imagine that we can learn from the past as a way of identifying solutions. So maybe, Robin, I can ask you to kick off. What can we learn from the past when we're seeking solutions to the current climate challenges?
Thank you very much for that, Deborah. Archaeologists are storytellers and have been for centuries. They've woven stories about the rise and fall of civilizations and cities. In the early days, we used to give a human agency for all of this, invasions, revolutions. Then we began to move to single explanations of climatic disasters. Then I think people began to realize how closely linked different aspects of civilization and culture and communities were, and the interdependencies within them. And now there is a real role for the deep past. And I think it gives us the opportunity to look at a very deep and rich and slightly contested past at times. And we can look at the relationship between settlement, but also their communities, the people who actually lived in them, and their use of both the environment around them, but also the technology available, and see how they adapted to challenges in environmental changes, both more sudden and longer term, through adaptation. Now, some of those adaptations, as in some of the great irrigation systems in, for example, northern Sri Lanka, are huge adaptations, allowing agglomerations of urban forms. But actually, there are cases from which we can learn, because often there is a pathway determinacy with this, that these relationships are so bound in that they are almost over-adapted, and there can be only one ending for that, with a descaling in terms of complexity, in terms of integration, and something that we might call a sort of a systems collapse, a collapse in these levels of integration. So I think it's really important to understand that the past has a record of adaptation, both successful and unsuccessful. Archaeology can also work in an amazing way of actually exploring ancient systems of technology and knowledge. So although it's a disaster-related one, with climate change, we'll see increasing disasters. Most narrators are aware of this. But during the post-disaster phase in Kathmandu, working with local communities there, working with artisans, we're able to, in a way, bridge between the hard science and indigenous knowledge to understand about seismic adaptation and about urban adaptation to risk, to allow sustainability and resilience to be built in. So for me, the past is not purely research. I look back to those days when everyone just thought it's research, but actually the past is incredibly important for, in a way, releasing the resilience of communities. And there is a tendency for us, particularly as archaeologists, to focus always on the tangible. But actually, for me, the intangible is a way, the key of unlocking that past. And whilst I sit in a university surrounded by books, often it's the practitioners who are the ones living and breathing this ancient technology who can allow us to unlock and bridge between the science-based aspects and then more on the arts, the humanities, the community, because that is the way that actually the past can be present. And finally, the point I would like to make is that past is under threat. It's under threat from climate change, but also from accelerated urbanization, mega infrastructure, which we tend to give concepts of efficiency to. And actually that record of the past, we are seeing incrementally removed. And with it, we are seeing those solutions, those possibilities of understanding more about uniquely cultural adaptations, which often will have lessons for the future.
Thanks so much, Robin. You've got us off to such a powerful start. I think that idea of the past being a mechanism to release the resilience of communities is an enormously important one. You know, in the IPCC, we rely on our paleo scientists to tell us about past climates, but I think past cultures could probably provide an important triangulation around that. So very powerful. Thank you for that. So Mia, I'm going to ask you the same question about what we can learn from the past, and you're particularly well positioned to talk to that because you are knowledgeable about part of a world where the civilization that you know, characterizes our society probably saw its genesis. So could you share with us your views on what we might be able to learn from the past that could help us with the present?
Well, the subject is very wide, and I didn't prepare a structured talk. What I can say is that in the area I am familiar with, which is broadly the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Middle East, there used to be different sorts of disaster. The sea changing level and taking parts of ancient cities like Sidon and Tyre, rising sea level is also threatening some Libyan Hellenistic sites like Apollonia, we have also doubt that some Euphrates civilization collapsed because of climatic change, but archaeologists were not able yet to prove it, but this is a guess that in past times also climate change played a role. Anyway, I more focused on the adaptation to climate in housing, in everyday housing. And it is interesting to note that some typologies of housing, like houses around courtyards, were common all around the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, with some slight changes. For a long time, we only had individual examples. One house was surveyed and published here and there. That was perhaps 100 years ago. And then other studies were able, in one city, to have several examples of houses, some small, some larger, with different aspects. And then some patterns emerged in this typological approach, and adaptation to climate was one of those aspects. I will come back. And this is not only in one city. This happened in different cities. And also the pattern was the same, to have a central courtyard. Many other features were different. The orientation, the pattern, even the elements around the courtyard, the importance of water and vegetation or not. And when we have been able to compare those local patterns with climate features, temperature, and rainfalls, even sunlight days in the year, we saw that the climate features of each place was specific and explained the difference in between city patterns. And this was very important because people sharing the same beliefs, the same culture, apparently the same great area, in fact, adapted themselves to their specific features. It could be dryness, it could be humidity, it could be sunlight, it could be different kinds of winds, and they adapted themselves to that. So that means that there is, in traditional building, the proof of an adaptation, and this proof has a potential, which means that if climatic features are going to change, this kind of housing can adapt itself, learning from others, from the models in other cities, in other historical cities. I am speaking of traditional housing. Well, this is my specialty, together with historical districts. So perhaps not everywhere, but in the case of rehabilitating historical districts, historical cities, if we understand the local climatic adaptation, we have first to keep that and perhaps to foresee how it is going to evolve in the rehabilitation works. Now we have also other cases where after disasters, which means destruction, wars, etc., old areas have to be rebuilt. And in this case, different patterns are possible. We have seen in Beirut that the local planners and decision maker decided to build like Western cities, high-rise towers, etc. We have here evidence that traditional housing, traditional patterns of housing have a potential and can adapt more easily to climate change and with an economy of carbon, etc., and taking into account the richness, or rather the poverty of people living in traditional areas. Now we have also...
Could I ask you to wrap up? Because I want to pose that question to Rohit as well. So if I could ask you to wrap up.
Oh, okay, well, we can see it later, but also in new planned areas, we can learn from the past, and we have examples of houses or even of planned settlements taking into account some lessons from the past, and this could be increased. And I will stop here.
Lovely, thank you. And I think your messaging reinforces what we heard from Jyoti, which is that learning from the past is a way of increasing our adaptive capacity, that a one-size-fits-all in terms of infrastructure provision and housing loses the nuances that have come from our past. And I think you've really underscored that well for us. Rohit, if I could move and ask you for your perspective on that question about what we can learn from the past.
Thank you very much, Deborah. So I would like to make, I think the panelists before have made very good comments, and I would just like to say 3 points to this question you have posed. I think the first important thing for us is to know what is it that we learn from the past. And that's not just limited to only certain kind of knowledge that may be in the buildings or might be embedded in certain ways of doing things. Actually, it is very difficult to compartmentalize this knowledge. The most important aspect of learning from the past is that it is holistic. It can be embedded in the way people live, in the way people communicate, in how they build, not only buildings, but also the entire settlements, how they have reacted to the context within which they have planned their settlements. So there's a lot of knowledge that is embedded, and we have to understand that this knowledge is not in the fields like disciplines that we today tend to kind of, categorize. So we have to first kind of keep that clear that this has to be really the first point to always see that adaptation is definitely embedded in the way traditional knowledge or the learnings from the past are there. But another important aspect for the knowledge is that the learnings from the past have always evolved. So they have not stayed the same. They have always looked at what they have gained through experience, and that experience can be positive as well as negative. So there is a tendency for us to romanticize about knowledge from the past. I think this is also a problem, because by bifurcating knowledge into traditional and scientific, we are actually falling in the wrong trap. In fact, the important thing in my view is to learn about not just what the past gives us in terms of the experience, but also the failures that have been have been accumulated. And then it's about trial and error. You then change it and you evolve it. There's a lot of innovation involved in the past. So I think we forget about the aspect of innovation in the way the past has always evolved over time. So what I mean to say here is that I think it is important now to look at the scientific aspects of traditional, and at the same time also have the other way around, look at how we can have the scientific aspects translated to the people in a more traditional way. We cannot use only scientific models. Sometimes those scientific models have to be also communicated in a way which is simpler, easier to understand, and makes meaning for the people, for whom they are intended. So I think we have to kind of look at it in both ways. And that is where I would also emphasize that learning about the challenges, needs, and opportunities in the current context has to be the key in which we have to see how the learnings from the past are contextualized for today. The other important thing which I also wanted to really emphasize here is the fact that learning from the past is always in a certain context. And if we have to make it relevant today, we have to also understand how that knowledge can be shared, not just among, because the challenges in the past have been that the knowledge that was there in one local context could not be shared with the other, in the wider scale. Now we have the opportunity to really disseminate the results that have been accumulated through a localized experience in the other areas, where maybe there is no opportunity to benefit from that experience. So this is the third point I wanted to emphasize, that how traditional knowledge or how our past has actually taught us to evolve and to contextualize in the current state has a lot of learnings that need to be disseminated beyond where they have actually originated. And then again, these have to be adapted to that different context. So there is no kind of static knowledge that we can just pick up and use. We have to always be able to learn from one particular context and then tailor it to another context. So I think that is something which is also really important for us to keep in mind when we think about all these aspects that are brought to us from the past. So it is not about just taking them from the past. We have to work on that knowledge, combine it with all the scientific instruments that we have available today, and take it to the future. I think that's the only way this past is going to become relevant to us, and not just limited to textbooks and research papers and good publications, but have a meaning for the society at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit. And again, some powerful messages for me, that learning by doing recognition is really critical. Realizing that, you've probably got sort of 80 failures for every 20 successes. And that has heuristic value. We learn from our failures, and I think we often don't engage with that. And I particularly liked your idea. We often think of trying to bring indigenous and local knowledge into the scientific realm, but bringing the science into the realm of indigenous and local knowledge, I think is an interesting, it indicates the kind of integration we're looking for. So thank you for those reflections. I think on that building block, I'm now going to turn to Ariadne and Chutney. So we've heard about the value that the past can bring, both in terms of increasing our adaptive capacity, unlocking our resilience, teaching us about the evolving nature of the human state. But really, the question I'm going to pose to you is, what are the challenges and barriers to implementing the kind of solutions that emerge from the realms of culture and heritage in your view? Perhaps Ariadne, I can start off with you.
Sure, thanks, Deborah. And going on that theme of learning from the past, I'll start by just acknowledging that I'm here on the lands of the Kulin Nations on Bunurong country in South Melbourne, Australia. And my acknowledgement is important because 200 years ago, when the settlers arrived on Bunurong country, the people here never ceded their lands and consent was never given to colonisation. So despite the impacts that the elders and that generation experienced, they resisted and survived. And it's because of their resilience that they are now able to, the future generation is now negotiating a treaty agreement with the state government of Victoria today. And this recognition, I think, is really important because it's not just for Australia, but the world, because Indigenous territories now protect 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So when we talk about the barriers, and the barriers in the present actually come from the past and relate to land tenure being a really big barrier to moving forward. And so it's the legacy of colonisation that is now reflected in our land tenure systems, and Indigenous tenures are not often formally recognised. And to be able to register a nature-based solution then requires you to have that secure tenure. And so we're seeing again that kind of potential for a new wave of colonisation to emerge as carbon markets start to mature across the world. But we also know that Indigenous people really hold those solutions. And I guess that's an experience that we've had here in Australia when the Carbon Farming Initiative Act was established here in Australia in 2011, Indigenous peoples really lobbied to have their native title rights recognised in those laws. And that has created a flourishing industry of Indigenous-led carbon solutions across Northern Australia, which are now financing community-based fire in savanna landscapes, which is creating remote jobs on country. It's reducing wildfire by about 50% in some locations. And it's also protecting really important biodiversity and Indigenous species like bilbies and Gordian finches. So when we get the policy and the legal settings and frameworks right, we can actually really start to unlock some amazing solutions. But it also goes to the point that we need to be creative and be rethinking how we co-design and how we bring together our community and government and scientists to be learning while doing on country as well, like in place, in location, in ways that Indigenous knowledge is respected and not just commercialised or kind of used for somebody else's benefit. So that benefit sharing piece becomes really important as well. I'll leave it there.
Great, and a very powerful message that many of our opportunities, but indeed our challenges, come from the past. And I think that's a strong message that will echo very strongly around the world, certainly on the continent I live on, Africa, with its long history of colonization. Many of the paths forward are in fact challenged by our past. So an incredibly powerful message. Thank you for that. Tony, can I ask you to come in on this issue of the challenges and barriers to implementing these culture-based solutions?
Absolutely. Thanks, Deborah. So my intervention is really around, I think, what we've been seeing from our research on adaptation in semi-arid regions across South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa actually is that culture can act both as a barrier and enabler. And I think some of the earlier speakers also alluded to that. So of course it can be harnessed. And there was the example that Jyoti gave of using Indigenous and local knowledge perhaps for forecasting rainfall, for example, and using that to, change your practices of growing and when you plant your crops and all of that. So there are these examples of culture being used to inform solutions. but then also in some ways culture and the practices, cultural practices that are there can also inhibit certain solutions, especially in conditions of unprecedented change. So perhaps a solution that was working for a 1 degree, 1.5 degree world might not work at higher degrees of warming. So an example from my own work is around crops that are typically considered male crops and female crops, and just the social norms around growing might dissuade certain people to grow certain crops which might work at higher warming levels. So I think there is that need to really also look at cultural practices critically and see where the barriers exist. There are examples, of course. The second thing I wanted to mention is, of course, culture is also dynamic. People's ideas of what they want from their life, their assets, their aspirations, they change. And so culture isn't the static thing. And I think we understand that, but then how does that really affect the kind of solutions that people are willing to invest in, people are willing to take up? I think there's less acknowledgement of that. And here we actually need to turn, I feel, to the behavioral sciences really to understand that why are there certain choices why are people taking certain choices to not adapt or not solutions that seem quite commonsensical, but people aren't doing it. And there are these psychological barriers that people have around perhaps not wanting to invest in something long-term, just making, the kinds of decision cycles that are there. As human beings, we take short-term decisions. And so I think that understanding from the behavioral sciences also needs to come in. For me, adaptation is at the core of adaptation is that it is a behavioral change. It's how people practice certain things, how they live, how they earn. And so these aspects of behavioral change, I think, are critical. And I just wanted to also highlight some work that we've been doing on urban agriculture in cities. And I think this really ties to the idea of trying to pluralize the solutions that we feel are available. Some of these practices are often termed climate adaptation practices or sustainability solutions, but we really need to think of how can we relate them to existing cultural practices to make them really be adopted by larger numbers of people. And in cities in India and Tanzania, where we're doing this project, we've actually seen that although there might be environmental considerations about growing one's own food and eating more sustainably, but actually many low-income settlements do grow their own food just because there are religious connotations of perhaps growing holy basil, and there are these cultural practices or things that you use in your cooking based on food cultures that you're part of. And I think those kinds of more intangible drivers of adopting some of these practices is what culture provides us, and recognizing that, I think, is really critical. So we're really missing out if we don't think of culture as an enabler. So that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thanks. And again, very rich input and stressing the importance of understanding human behavior, because I suppose it's ultimately that behavior that gives rise to our culture, and our culture which gives rise to our behavior. And so linking and understanding the behavioral sciences is an important thing. And I know this is something we've certainly discussed in the IPCC as a way of trying to understand the climate change challenge and response to it. Just with my eye on the clock now, I think we've had some incredibly rich inputs, and it really indicates the diversity that culture and heritage offers us as a way of understanding not only our present, our past, but how we might respond to the challenges of the present by learning from the past. What I'd like to do now with my panelists is give you each just 1 minute to reflect on the question of, if we have to mobilize this power of culture and heritage to tackle the climate change challenge, what do you think is the one most important thing we do to mobilize the potential of culture and heritage to tackle the climate change challenge? And I'm going to do a round robin. So just one thing, and each have 1 minute for conveying that priority. Robin, can I go back to you and start off with you and give your opportunity to tell us what you think could be done to mobilize this potential?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Deborah. For me, it's the interdisciplinary approach. And also, it means one has to straddle what are academic silos: sciences, natural, physical, arts and humanities, social sciences. We need to straddle those. We also need to meaningfully link with partners. And I think more than that, it's actually begin to understand the inequalities. We are hierarchical, academic, or geos. Many of those who are in the indigenous knowledge systems, it's more negotiated. Perhaps it's flatter, but it's more negotiated. We need to acknowledge that. And my final pointer, and I think this is the most critical for me, from my experience working in post-disaster scenarios, both human agency, but also natural agency, is all of our good intentions tend to be forgotten and left behind for efficiency and one size fits all. And I think with climate change, we will see increasing disasters. We will see increasing conflict if we do not learn how to be agile and to bring in all of those good intentions and good practices in an agile and urgent matter. Actually, we will continue to fail. Thank you.
Brilliant. And that emphasis on agility, I think, is absolutely critical. Tony, what would be your one thing to mobilize this opportunity?
I have to build on what Robin said about straddling disciplines, but also straddling different knowledge systems. And I think here the key is really, as researchers, as practitioners, to come into this conversation with humility, to recognize that the knowledge systems that we are wedded to, of course, are important and they hold certain meaning, but to just come in with humility to understand that another discipline or another way of meaning making in the world also holds value and meaning. So I think that's why, to me, that is one big one. And the second one, I think, is, which I have written about in that one of the solution, the background papers that we've developed, is trying to recognize that where people are coming from sharply determines where people go. So just a really an eye to histories of people, and that, of course, leads us to understanding that there are certain parts of the world that are underprivileged, they've been marginalized because of their histories. And so recognizing that when we think about solutions for the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Sunny. Such an important message, humility in approaching this knowledge and using it. I don't think we could stress that enough. Rohit, can I ask you for your one priority in mobilizing the power of culture and heritage?
I think I will also again build on the other two previous panelists, and I would introduce another key thing, and that is governance. Because all this also has to translate into governance, which means that if we have to mobilize the power of culture, it also means that institutions which are siloed have to also learn to work together with each other. And culture sector is so much, rather than making it as a separate siloed kind of institution that has to deal with everything related to culture, I think mainstreaming culture in all the other sectors is really the key, and we need to work very much. And I think what has been done through this IPCC collaboration and all that is going on is the first big step towards that. And I think we have to take it down to the country and to the we have to scale it down. I think that's something which is important. So one key buzzword I would introduce here is governance. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more around that need to embed it. Ariadne, your one key thing to mobilize culture and heritage.
Right, building on everyone else's thoughts and perspectives, I think that recognizing Indigenous knowledges and recognizing that knowledge is held in these living languages, and that over half of our languages are Indigenous, and that's where that traditional knowledge is actually held. So revitalizing, investing in Indigenous knowledge and recognizing that there's over 5,000 distinct cultures that have evolved over thousands of years, in a deep relationship with both place and nature. And so how do we learn to listen deeply too? So although we need to be agile and quick and find solutions, we also need to be present and listen deeply so that we can understand others' perspectives and be able to bring those knowledges and ways of being in relationship with nature into the future and the present.
Well, that's such a powerful message and really resonates. I come from a country with 11 official languages, so language is such an important transfer of knowledge. Samir, your one important thing to mobilize the power of culture and heritage.
Yes, well, it would be important to safeguard existing settlements, existing traditional settlements, because they are living examples of how to adapt to climate. However, we can understand challenges that has to be overtaken. The social one first, because previously large families used to live in those houses, and now families are much smaller, whether they are rich or poor, they are smaller. So even in traditional large houses, you may find several families. There is also a question of scale. There is a question of availability of materials. Sometimes wood is no more available in some areas. And also there is a question of skills and knowledge of people who can provide and implement housing for large numbers. Thank you for your attention.
Lovely, thank you. And that's such an important message, to protect what we have so that that information is carried through time. We are 1 minute over time, so I would just like to thank all of the panelists for their input today. You've been brilliant. You've offered a wealth of views on this important topic. I'm hoping that some of the key message you've left us with, which is about integration, about using culture as a mechanism to enable and unlock potential, the reality checks you've given about the fact that culture can also be a challenge as well as an enabler. I'm hoping that that feeds into our subsequent discussions. So thank you, panelists, one and all. And again, sincere thanks to my fellow co-chairs of the Science and Steering Committee. This now ends our third and final public session of the co-sponsored meeting on culture, heritage, and climate change. Thank you very much for your attention.